Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Fighting against poverty, an area in which China has invested huge amounts of time, efforts, and resources over years, decades even. On Tuesday, the State Office of Information issued a report called simply Poverty Alleviation, China's Experience and Contribution. So what is the significance of the country's achievements and how can it now maintain and build on them? And how can China's successful poverty alleviation experience be of any help to other countries? To find out more, I'm joined by Michele Geraci, former Undersecretary of State at Ministry of Economic Development in Italy, He Weiwen, Senior Fellow at Center for China and Globalization, and Professor John Gong, University of International Business and Economics. That's our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. Let me start with you, John. The reason we're talking about poverty alleviation is because the State Council Information Office released a white paper on that topic today. A white paper usually announces policies or a track record of what has been done. So what do you make of the white paper?
Well, certainly this white paper is an authoritative document about China's poverty alleviation effort coming from the State Council. This summarizes what China has been doing, what the lessons have been learned, the nature of these programs, and I think it serves two purposes. One is that it gives a very comprehensive overview, authoritative overview of what has been achieved at this point. And second, I think it's a great exercise of sharing China's experiences, sharing what China has learned with the international community, especially countries that are interested, are keen on the same kind of goals, that is to alleviate poverty.
And Geraci, why do you think the Chinese government stressed poverty relief so heavily? And what is the main reasons that the CPC can deliver on those targets?
Well, the main reason is because I think this is a historic achievement, having lifted 800 million people out of poverty and reached zero absolute poverty this year. I think it is an achievement of which China can be proud of. The practical thing, of course, has impacted the life of those people involved, but it also gives the Chinese economy for the future an additional level of stability. Because what China is doing now is not stopping here, but it's bringing these 200-300 million people that over the last 20 years have moved into above the poverty line, and slowly moving them towards the middle class. So that we always talk about the GDP growth level. It may be lower, maybe than we have seen in the past, but it will be of a better quality. And better quality means that it's more evenly distributed. And if China can manage to bring these, what used to be poor people, into middle class over the next 5-10 years, it will have reached by 2030 a middle class that could be 600-700 million people. And this would be the engine that could fuel stability for the future. So this also shows insight into medium and even long-term planning, because these efforts to take decades. And I think this is the other interesting learning point for the rest of the world, for Africa, other parts of Asia. There is an inertia in the system. We had, I think, I go by memory, 830 counties on below poverty line. Now this number has gone to zero. Income has gone from 6,000 to 12,000 renminbi per year, so doubling in only 7 years. So these are things that can be done only with the good planning, and especially with what has been said is the targeted approach, which I'm very keen to try to explain also to the wider Western audience, because I think this has been the key success factor, the targeted poverty alleviation program.
And the context, John, is of course China has made remarkable economic progress, has changed from an agricultural economy, agrarian economy, to a middle-income economy. So you believe this economic development is still serve the bigger part of the poverty relief work?
Absolutely. This document actually has a whole chapter devoted to that topic you just alluded to. As I said previously in the past, poverty alleviation at a very fundamental level is about economic development. Otherwise, it will not be sustainable. I mean, we're not talking about government giving out checks, giving out handouts to people. We are trying to help people who help themselves. So, so this is, definitely the focal point of this whole thing is that the economic development lies underneath everything. And for that to happen, the government, of course, had policy instruments that it can do to facilitate that happening. For example, building infrastructures, maybe at with some subsidies, building other things, educate people, for example, provide assistance to people, credit financing, all these soft infrastructure as well as hard infrastructure that are conducive to commerce, conducive to economic activities. I mean, that's really the fundamental thing. I think this is the biggest takeaway from this report. I would think this is the biggest takeaway. I mean, this poverty alleviation thing cannot stand alone in a vacuum aside from China's overall economic development success story so far.
And there is actually data to back that up. The white paper mentions that since the start of the alleviation efforts, the GDP of those impoverished areas has actually maintained rapid growth. The average annual income per capita has been 7 percentage points higher than the national average. Right. So John, what can those areas make that happen? Why it is above the average growth targets of the country?
Well, I think this wouldn't have happened without our whole of a nation, whole of a government approach. I mean, we really mobilize a lot of resources from all aspects of the government, from all aspects of society, and we do this in a very precise way. We call it targeted poverty alleviation. So I think this is another big lesson that has to be coming from the government. The government needs to play a leadership role. I mean, the market doesn't function that way. The market is typically, facilitates cherry picking. I mean, the areas that are more easier for economic development get developed first. The more remote areas, the more mountainous areas, for example, they need infrastructure investment. A free market is not going to provide that. This is another big lesson that China has done a wonderful job in terms of mobilizing entire resources from society, from the government, to put in place soft and hard infrastructure. And this is critically important.
Targeted poverty relief. Michaela, what do you think of this approach? China obviously has been very proud of creating such a method that is targeted poverty alleviation, that is to look at each and every impoverished household with surgical precisions. How do you look at this?
Well, that is the point. When we talk in general in the economic circles about poverty, we tend to think like a lump of a group of people, poor people in an area, in a continent, in a region. What China has done instead is, this is very important to tell the audience, just a database of each individual household. The report mentions specifically identifying poor people in rich areas. There are poor people in the urban areas. There are poor people in Shanghai, in Beijing, just as much as there would be poor people in the low-income areas of Guizhou and the southwest. But it also identifies the rich people, or relatively wealthier people, in so-called poor areas, so that the policy can be targeted to take account for these, let's say, intra-city differences. So that instead of lumping a region as poor, or a city or a county as poor, the target database was providing individual information on what the needs of each individual were. The second point I think is very important is, and the report mentioned, is it has given hope to people, sense of achievement, and the self-reliance, because it is fine that at the beginning the government does help and substitute where the market, like we said, cannot intervene. So the government gives the little spin the wheel a little bit, but then the wheel needs to spin by itself, and this can be done when the people have a hope that now they have been lifted and they can be the master of their own destiny. In a way, if I may, it's almost like what happened in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping first started off with rural reforms, allowing people to basically make extra profit out of their own land. People realized that their move of land was not just a capped income, but any extra effort would be allowed for them to make extra income. And this gave them the hope and the direction to be more active and more efficient. And this is the next step that we're going to see. We're going to see now these former poor people to start being the productive engine of the economy for that segment of the income. And this comes with hope and expectation that they can be running their own fortunes.
So, John, as Michela just explained, what are the idiosyncrasies in terms of institution and the copyable models for the rest of the world?
Yeah, one thing I think is very unique, and it's actually quite creative, is to establish a entire institutional arrangement for poverty alleviation. That means that there would be grassroots level organizations devoted to this. There would be a database established for this purpose. There would be efforts to coordinate government agencies in terms of providing help to these households. So it's
that demands a huge
say,
bureaucracy which is accountable and responsible and dedicated to the efforts.
Yes, I think poverty alleviation has become one of the key government functions at grassroots level for county governments, for example, for township governments. And these government officials will be evaluated at the end of the day for their performance in this regard. And I think this is a great invention, in my view. I mean, you've never seen any local governors, township mayors, being evaluated for poverty alleviation in most countries, I would say.
Yeah.
So I think this is a great invention, and this is something that that is very unique and a great lesson, in my view. Economic development is not just about development at an aggregate level. It's about everyone. Everyone. Nobody's going to be left behind. Everybody has to be lifted out of poverty, has to be able to lead a decent life with dignity. So I think, including these evaluation metrics in the performance evaluation for these government officials is another big lesson that the world can take away from.
Michela, do you think the Chinese Communist Party's practices of evaluating an official's performance with his poverty relief efforts is something that the rest of the world can learn and take some parts of it?
We can. Following up on what we said, the shift on local official advancement from GDP to poverty alleviation is an important change, because when the local government only has GDP growth as their target, they can easily achieve it by some investment, and sometimes the extreme focus on GDP only can create disparities. One other thing is instead what has been done. The target has been zero poverty in your county. That means that people focus less on aggregate average values and go to the bottom of the income scale to try to lift those people up. And this has completely been a change in the philosophy of reward, together with, for example, other measures like green, pollution, and so on. Now, the Chinese success, I think, has been based on the fact that China is a centralized system. Like we said, we have grassroots organizational institution that can be trickled down from Beijing down to the provincial, prefecture, and city and county village levels. Now, it is a little bit more difficult to do this, for example, in Africa, where we have 50 different countries with different, of course, political systems, different levels of development. And of course, we need to have what I call it the China experience adapted to the local situation. In Malawi would be one way. In Ethiopia, where we know China is very active, trying to do something similar, migrating rural people from the rural areas of Ethiopia into urban areas of Ethiopia. So in a way, duplicating the urbanization models of the late 80s, early 90s in China. So the learning is how to reward, of course, every country has a problem. The money is not always efficiently used. There is corruption everywhere in every country, but it is important that things gets done. And so I think it is, of course, in the hands of local governments around the world to make this experience theirs. And I think the investment that China can do in infrastructure development, for example, in Africa, will be complementary to the poverty alleviation of the African countries. In a way, I see the development of Africa being driven by foreign companies, foreign rich companies, countries like China, Europe, United States do the bulk of the investment,
Yeah.
and the local government try to do what China has done for the targeted poverty angle.
I want to follow up on that. We have another guest, Mr. He Weiwen from the Center for China and Globalization joining us. Mr. He, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative to expand cooperation and social development. And according to the data from the World Bank, the initiative will help 7.6 million people out of extreme poverty and 32 million out of moderate poverty in these countries. So can we say this is China's international aspect of poverty alleviation?
Certainly, it is. When we examine the major measures, goals of BRI, compare that of the United Nations 2030 SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, we can find a high convergence. In other words, all the measures and efforts and exact practices of BRI are for poverty eradication and for the people's better lives, for education, housing, lives, and employment. So that is all in that right direction. So by BRI, China can contribute greatly to the alleviation of poverty in the world and also to develop its industry, commerce, and also in other infrastructure along the route. So that is a good component of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
And John, what is your take on maybe China's reaching out to the world, not necessarily just the capital and technology, but also poverty alleviation methods and experiences?
I would say this is a side effect, it's a positive side effect. I wouldn't necessarily characterize China's BRI as per se as a poverty alleviation effort in other countries, but the fact of the matter is it does create jobs, it does create a lot of opportunities for small businesses in these countries, and in fact leading to poverty alleviation. So this is a nice side effect to have. And I think amid a lot of criticism of BRI, a lot of people tend to ignore the fact that this induced effect of job creation, not just associated with these infrastructure projects itself, but other induced economic activities, other investments, other manufacturing projects in these countries, and they will ultimately create jobs. A lot of the I would say a lot of the manufacturing projects, investment projects, as a result of the BNR initiative, is mostly in manufacturing. And manufacturing, I think particularly in labor-intensive manufacturing, and they create jobs. And they create jobs mostly for poor people, for the laborers. So I think there's a overall positive effect on these countries, and that's a fact that we should not ignore.
Mikhail, according to the permanent representative of Singapore to the UN, Mr. Burhan Ghafoor, he said in an online meeting that China's achievements show that poverty eradication is actually possible and achievable. And Mr. He just mentioned it is also in line, in sync with the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Do you think the global efforts of poverty alleviation will get a boost because what China has been doing and it is being showing to the rest of the world?
I honestly hope so, because really this is what the world needs. I have tried to add my small contribution by having my own country, Italy, join the Belt and Road, because I strongly believe that transport, infrastructure do not just carry goods, they also carry improvement in the condition of standard of living. So I do hope that this effort by China can be extended in the region of the Belt and Road, and in fact in any other part of the world. We have poor homeless people in Italy, in New York. Like I said, it's not just a rich poor country that have poor people. Only rich country have pockets of poverty that sometimes gets neglected by some of the international organizations. So I do think that when we speed the economic development, and I'm a strong believer in the infrastructure, transport, railway, even sea transport, they do carry not just goods, as I said, but they also carry welfare to the people. And that's why I think the Belt and Road should be not seen as a charity organization. Of course, it's not a charity initiative. We're there to make development of the country, but as a byproduct, then, as it happened in the case of China, that has first developed its own economy and then has lifted people out of poverty, I think this can happen also in the other countries, part of the Belt and Road. First, we bring development, we bring some kind of prosperity, and immediately after, also the poor people will be lifted up to the middle income class. I have to say, these days we have to recognize that there are some challenges. So it is important how things are promoted. We need to strike the balance between the local and foreign intervention in host countries. That's why I am a proponent of a triangular approach. It should be the host country, part of the project, China, and other Western countries, so that we completely get rid of any political friction, which, to be honest, this is really not what we need now. And the way to get rid of it is to have all the three components playing together: Asia, the West, and then the local host country together. So there is no competition between Italy, US, China, Korea, and Japan. We're all on the same boat, because you know what? When we develop those developing countries, we expand also the market for our goods, because in the West, we are not the region of the world with the highest economic prospect. So we need, not just for ethic, but also for economic reason, to make sure that Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa develop. Otherwise, we in the West, we in Europe, cannot find markets for our goods.
But obviously, poverty alleviation is a continuous undertaking. Mr. He, although China has announced it has bid farewell to absolute poverty, but it also says the overall work has not yet ended. For China, eradicating relative poverty is still a heavy task. And there is also the danger of those who are already lifted out of poverty going back to poverty. So how can this country try to prevent those people coming back to poverty trap?
I think we are still facing two different tasks. First, to guard against any return of the absolute poverty by those people who have just been lifted out of poverty. That means we should pay attention not to let them go back to poverty again. That means that we should keep them productive, make them making money by themselves, making it sustainable. Also, it is so important to form a permanent mechanism that the strong developed provinces support the backward province, and strong developed counties, regions support backward poor regions, to make them permanent so as to secure they will not go back to poverty again. That's absolute poverty. And the relative poverty, we should pay more attention, that we should advance our poverty alleviation efforts, moving from eradicating the absolute poverty to eradicating the relative poverty. That means we should pay enough attention to the harmonization of regional development to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. For instance, in the province of Guangdong, we know, which is the #1 province economic power in China. Still, there are 21 cities in the province. 7 of them are very strong, and 40 of them have per capita GDP below the national average. So important thing is to have harmonious regional development to make all the people rich in the future.
John, what is your idea? Obviously, COVID is also a complicating factor. It has made many people's life even more challenged.
Well, first of all, let me say that poverty is always a relative concept. I mean, we can argue all day about what is the meaning of poverty, relative poverty, these terms in terms of per capita income and all that. But I think ultimately, what we really concern about is that people will be able to live a life that has decency, that has dignity. That means that he has a decent shelter, he has no worry about food on the table, he has access to adequate education, and kids have adequate access to education and healthcare, these sort of things. I think for this country, for China, at this point, we're not going to see the kind of absolute poverty that we probably see a lot in Africa, for example. I think overall this country's economy has advanced enough to afford everyone a decent life. I think the real task, in my view, is to prevent a widening gap of income distribution, to prevent income disparity. And I think in this regard, there are a lot of things that government has to be very careful about. As Professor Wen has said that, Professor He has said that even in a very prosperous province like Guangdong, there are still a lot of people living at the lower end of the social strata. So, so I think in terms of preventing the people from sliding back, I think the overall public policy has to keep this inclusiveness goal in mind, that economic opportunities, economic fruits have to be shared among a wider population, and that has to be an inclusive growth model.
And I have 2 minutes left. Mr. He, another even grander project, probably more difficult, is the revitalization of the countryside. China promises by 2035 it will achieve modernization of agriculture. Rural areas will be modernized and restructured, and a lot of poverty still in the rural areas. How can China revitalize that part of the country?
Yes, the rural area will certainly be the chief target for our growth, the concentrated efforts to uplift their growth development level. For instance, we say that all the developed countries in the world, we can see they have developed rural areas. They have basically no very backward rural areas. So without the modernization of rural areas, we cannot have the modernization of the whole China. So that means in rural areas, we should develop not only agriculture, but we should combine the primary, secondary, and tertiary industries combined to make them moving up the ladder. So the rural areas can also develop high-tech, and also rural areas, small towns that could be connected, coordinated with the large cities, so for the whole regional development and attain the Commonwealth.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. He, thank you, John, and thank you, Michaela. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN, talking about poverty alleviation. I'm Zhou in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.